Hi everybody, this is the carbohydrate video, and carbohydrates are one of the four major macromolecules that we need to talk about in biology. So let's take a look at some of the functions of carbohydrates, but more specifically, let's look at the monomers. So the monomer of a carbohydrate is known as a monosaccharide. That's a very generic term that's used to talk about something that's a very simple sugar, but only one sugar unit, and that's what the mono stands for. So mono means one, and saccharide is sugar. So this is one individual sugar unit. The most famous of these sugar units is glucose, and the other two sugars that I want you to know are fructose and galactose. Now all of these three sugars that I'm showing here are monosaccharides, and they look something like this. This just shows one individual sugar unit. Now, if I wanted to build this sugar unit and make what's called a disaccharide, then I'd have to look at this reaction right here. Based on the information that I gave you in the last video, you should be able to look at this reaction and determine what kind of reaction it is. So after taking a look at this, I hope that you're thinking that it's a dehydration reaction. And here it's a dehydration reaction because water is being pulled out of the system. So now what we have are two monomers that are now bound by a bond. Let's take a look next at disaccharides next. Di stands for two and saccharide sugar. So a disaccharide is when we see two sugar units that are bound by a bond. And the three major disaccharides that I'd like you to know for this class are maltose, sucrose, and lactose. Sucrose is the most famous one that we are familiar with because that's table sugar. So that's a sugar that you might sprinkle on your cornflakes. You can find maltose in malt beer, for example, or anything that has like a malt flavor to it. And lactose is found in milk. Okay, I don't expect you to know the individual units that make up the disaccharide. I just want you to know these disaccharides and know that a disaccharide are two individual units bound together. But I don't expect you to know what makes up a maltose or what makes up a sucrose or what makes up a lactose. Just know that these molecules are disaccharides. Now, if I took a disaccharide molecule and in my own system I wanted to build a more complex carbohydrate, how would I do that? Well, I would need another monomer or another monosaccharide and begin building from this disaccharide to get a polysaccharide. So let's take a look at the polysaccharides. There are three major polysaccharides that I want you to know. The first one is glycogen. These are the three major polysaccharides, by the way. The first one is glycogen, and this is a polysaccharide that's found in animal tissue. So this picture shows animal tissue in the liver as well as muscle tissue. And glycogen is an energy reserve where we take excess amount of glucose in our system and we don't want to let go of that glucose. We don't want to let it go out of our system. We want to keep it. And one way of doing that is to take many glucose molecules and build it and store it in the form of glycogen. As it turns out, glycogen is an immediate energy reserve for our system. So when we are low in glucose, we have a very low blood glucose because we haven't eaten in a while, our body will tap into the glycogen reserves found in the liver and in the muscle cells and begin breaking down glycogen to extract energy from it. Starch and cellulose are the two polysaccharides that are found in plants. We do not store glucose in the form of starch, nor do we store it in the form of cellulose, but plants do. Plants store glucose in the form of starch for energy, shown here, but they also can take glucose and build a structure, a polysaccharide called cellulose. Cellulose is the most abundant organic molecule on Earth, and we find cellulose in the cell walls of plants, and it's made up of like anything that's wood or the bark material, that's cellulose. So now let's look at the functions. After looking at the polysaccharides, we need carbohydrates for energy reserve, not just to eat and get energy from our food, but also when we eat excess amount of food, we need to store that extra glucose that we've consumed in the form of glycogen. And plants need to store glucose as well, but they do so in the form of starch. And the other important function for carbohydrates is for structural support. And looking at the cell wall of plants, that's made up of cellulose and bark, anything that's woody. And I think your textbook mentions that the pages that you're reading is made up of cellulose. So all of that is really important for maintaining structural support. And to note that if you were to look at the structure of the monosaccharides and the disaccharides and the polysaccharides, you'll find a pattern repeating, and that pattern is that carbohydrates are made up of only 3 atoms: carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Over and over again, we see those 3 atoms get used to make carbohydrates. I'll leave you with that, and to be continued, because you will be moving on to the next macromolecule.